You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
So one day in 1936, a group of young artists are sitting in a Paris cafe. Pablo Picasso comments on one of the women's bracelets, saying how anything can be wrapped in fur. She replies in jest, saying, "Even this teacup?" And they continued to make obnoxious jokes, demanding the waiter bring them more fur. Now, in what seems like the ultimate sort of obnoxious hipster artist move, Meret Oppenheim actually took that joke and made it into a real work of art, which was later bought by MoMA and is today considered to be the quintessential surrealist object.
I feel like who art ed?
We'll try to spice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, where we explore visual arts in an audio medium. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and joining me today, I have Janet Taylor, an artist, art teacher at the high school level, and an art teacher's art teacher, doing stuff with the colleges. You've been working with the Art of Ed University for a while. You're just doing all the things. I feel like I'm always seeing in your feed that you're presenting in this place and that place and working with this college or this high school. Thank you for taking the time to come join me here on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's nice to be back again. It's been a while.
It's been a while, and I appreciate that you are so flexible. I feel so funny. Like, when I asked you if you would have time to join me and which artist would you like to talk about, you had said, was it Merritt Johnson? Right?
Yeah.
And I'm looking through my messages and I just see Merritt, totally different spelling. And I thought, oh, Meret Oppenheim, object is on the AP art history list. This will be perfect. Let's talk about it. So I appreciate that you're willing to talk about a different Merritt today.
I'm always happy to talk about anybody, right? It's so fun to talk about all these artists. I love your podcast. It's great.
Thank you. There's so much good stuff to cover. And today, because I do know you are a high school teacher and I teach at the elementary, but I still appreciate the challenges our students go through. I'm trying to make a purposeful effort to cover a lot of stuff from the AP art history list because those kids got to learn about 250 different artists and works. And this is one from that list, Meret Oppenheim. Now, she was born October 6th, 1913 in Berlin, and she was named after, I'm going to struggle with this pronunciation as I struggle with all pronunciations, Meretline. I'm going with that. It was a kid from a novel, Green Henry. I guess Meretline was the character from the book, basically like a wild child living off in the woods. And I feel like that wild streak, aptly named there. You know, I don't know if names really sort of determine who you are or we start to see those connections after the fact and sort of implanted on there. But I feel like that's a nice bit of foreshadowing because she definitely kind of marched to her own drum. In 1914, her father, who was a doctor, he had to serve in World War I. I mean, pretty much anybody of a certain age had to serve in the Great Wars. It feels weird calling it the Great Wars.
Right.
I don't think there's ever been a great war, but great in the sense of it being massive. But Meret's mother took the kids to live in Switzerland with her parents at that time. And so while she's in Switzerland, Oppenheim is exposed to just tons of art. Her family, like I said, her dad's a doctor, obviously an educated family. They are getting into the culture, and she just fell in love with the new modern art movements at that time. It feels modern art, I feel like, is a term we should clarify. When we're talking about modern in the art context, we're talking about stuff 100 years ago.
Right, versus contemporary, right? Like it's a very difficult fine line to define, isn't that? When we talk about it as in terms of vocabulary, right?
Yeah, when we're talking about those historical periods, the modern era is like the late 19th to mid 20th century. I always just explain it to my students with like the idea that the modernists were trying to get down to something that was sort of timeless and universal. And it's that hubris of artists and the young generation always thinking that what they are doing will always be cool. But of course it never is. So she's looking at the new modern art at that time, expressionism, cubism, fauvism, all of the isms were going on at that point. And in 1928, her father had her reading Carl Jung. Carl Jung is, or was, I suppose I should say, a psychologist. I believe he studied from Freud, if I recall correctly.
I thought so too.
But
yeah, or they were around the same time. I'm not sure.
yeah, I believe Jung learned a bit from Freud, but expanded on his theories. And while Freud was talking a lot about the unconscious and sort of like the personal ideas of like your personal unconscious and everything like that, Carl Jung was talking more about the collective unconscious. And I think of it more as like the sort of societal implications of things, the socialized aspects that lead to our personalities. Think like Joseph Campbell, Hero with a Thousand Faces, these archetypal figures and everything like that. So she's reading about what at that time was sort of cutting edge psychological theory, and she begins recording her dreams. I guess she would continue to do that, writing down in detail, analyzing her dreams throughout her life. So 1929, she's at this point, what, like 16 years old. She's looking at Paul Klee, goes to a retrospective of his works, and it kind of expands her mind to the possibilities of abstraction in art. Meret Oppenheim is often sort of pigeonholed as just one of many surrealist artists, but she was kind of dabbling in different things. I think what she liked about the surrealist movement was that it was so open to different forms of expression and different experimentations.
I find that interesting that so first of all, I just have to pause. Sorry.
Yeah.
The surrealism and the dreams really go hand in hand, right? Is like trying to understand and make sense of what's going on, or symbolisms that kind of go into that. So I can understand why this is kind of, the Paul Klee thing was interesting to me because it makes sense to me with her connection to surrealism. And Paul Klee also, I think, had a lot of his work really talked a lot about like childhood and kind of the inner workings of that too. But his work is not like hers at all. So it's really interesting to me how that kind of was an inspiration for her for abstraction. So I found that very curious as well. It's always interesting to see what artists are inspired by, because it doesn't always reflect in their work, if that makes sense. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, and I just think of it as, she was one of those people who just went through the world like a sponge, just soaking up all of these disparate influences. And that's how she came up with something new and different. And I think like a lot of artists, she just kind of felt like labels were confining. I think that's really where the tension came with surrealism, because, it was the surrealist label and the philosophy attached to it. She felt like she had other broader interests and didn't want to be held down to just that one style and that one category. So 1932, she's like 18 years old. She moves to Paris to study art, primarily painting, from what I understand. And within just a year, she's like getting a big break. I mean, she meets Hans Arp. I cannot pronounce names, even short ones. Hans Arp, Alberto Giacometti. They visit her studio. They liked what they saw enough to invite her to participate in a surrealist show. And she's like befriending all of these big names. And I know that like earlier in their careers, they weren't all like the big names from art history that we think of them now. Right. But it just seems like at this point in Paris, everybody was hanging out with each other. So she becomes friends with like Man Ray, Marcel Duchamp, Max Ernst, Andre Breton. And I guess we should start talking about like her best known work here. And as I've already said, it was Object, also parenthetically called Breakfast in Fur. I'm not going to attempt the French pronunciation there for it. She made this in 1936, and as the story goes, one day she's at a cafe with Pablo Picasso and Dora Maar. Maar was a photographer, poet, painter, and she and Picasso were also romantically entangled. So they're having lunch, and Picasso looks at this fur-lined bracelet that Meret Oppenheim is wearing. And he made some comment like, you can put fur on anything and it just becomes so luxurious. And she responds by saying like, even this teacup. And they're laughing. And then, you know, she has to take the joke even further and says to the waiter, more fur, please, or whatever, which I got to think like delightful and charming if you're at that table. But can you imagine being the waiter? Like that has to be so confusing. Like you're just trying to do your job and someone is requesting fur and laughing. I don't know. So she goes on with this because, and this is one of those moments where I'm like, I like her. She does not know the meaning of taking a joke too far and then goes off to her studio and takes a teacup and a saucer and a spoon and carefully and methodically wraps them all in fur. And that is where we get her most famous piece, Object, from 1936.
And that waiter's like grandson is going, that was my dad. Who provided the
yes.
No, I'm just kidding.
Probably complaining about how Picasso was a bad tipper or something like
probably.
That. Tried to pay in a sketch on a napkin. But let's shift the focus a little bit from like the history and background. I want to get into a little bit of the analysis of the piece now. So as you're looking at this, what are you seeing? What are you thinking? What's jumping out at you?
Okay, so this is actually, so I've taught sculpture for quite a long time, and this is a piece that I often show my students. And I know when you look at it the first time, you're like, it's kind of one of those pieces that you're like, okay, and you kind of are not sure what to do with it, right? It's literally a teacup, a saucer, and then a little spoon resting on the saucer. And all of it is covered in fur. And it's not just like covered in fur. It has this really beautiful attention to movement and application to it, right? The outside of the saucer is like this very light fur color, and it kind of swoops around the outside. So it's kind of soft, almost like you'd be holding the saucer and kind of petting, like petting it, you know? And then on the inside is the fur is like coming up out of the saucer, you know, it's like aligned, it's lined on the inside so that the fur kind of swoops up. So you can imagine if you were to like pick this up and drink out of it, like actually the interesting idea of this functional object, right? Being no longer really functional because you're drinking out of it. You've got fur in your mouth. It's like so disgusting.
All sorts of health code violations
right?
there.
Oh my God, yes. And you know, like anytime you get like one piece of hair in your mouth while you're eating or drinking, it's like the, you know, most repulsive thing, right? Isn't it the most annoying thing?
I'm dying inside as you're just describing it.
Right. So it's pretty interesting to me, to look at this in the idea of, you know, form and function, right? So you have this really aesthetically pleasing work of art or pieces that have no longer really true function to them. And then, looking at it a little bit more, it has some interesting, I kind of equate it, it looks like something I would see at like a natural history museum, right? Like something you would see, like an artifact found way back when, because of the type of fur that was used, right? It's not just like poodle hair or something like that, right? It's like, what is it, like Chinese gazelle or something?
It was a Chinese
Yeah.
gazelle. Yeah.
So it's like very, I don't know, methodically lined, very meticulously crafted, I would say. You could tell there's a lot of care that went into this. So a lot of intention, right?
Yeah, she had to work really hard to make those objects useless. And I think there's something kind of funny about that, like just in the playfulness of it. Like, especially when we consider that historical context, this was the modern period, and other things in modern art and architecture. You had mentioned form follows function. Louis Sullivan in the late 19th, early 20th century was coining that term, saying form must ever follow function. And so like she's totally disregarding that and aggressively so, you know.
The other thing so going back, this is why I was like, I think I'm getting ahead of myself when we're talking about like Dada and Surrealism, right? But like, this is a great example too of this play on words, play on context of materials. And I think, prior to this time period, there wasn't a lot of that, right? A lot of it was very purposeful and aesthetically pleasing, or had a very traditional foundation. I mean, obviously we have your isms that you talked about where things started to change, right? Artists started to look at artwork a little differently, but the Dada movement is like one of my favorites, because, it's kind of this absurdity and thinking about how pieces come together to create a new context for that artwork or new meaning, right? And so in this piece is really interesting to me because it's, the idea of this teacup, something that was traditionally very feminine, very proper, high society, and it's wrapped in a fur that is very like primal, animalistic, right?
It is, but also like the fur is also a high society thing.
Oh, good point.
Like
Yeah.
it would also be very fancy and elegant to be draping yourself in a portion of an animal carcass.
Mm-hmm.
Like
that's true.
Which I think on some level, the fact that you're taking this high society thing of like, a fancy teacup and this high society thing of fur, and you're combining them to make something that is useless and revolting.
But
in
also
some
gorgeous.
ways, but also, well,
and appealing, right?
Well, you're right, because there is this sensory engagement that it does look soft and inviting, in the tactile sense, like to touch it, it feels like it would be nice and luxurious in some ways, but like to use it from its from its original purpose, to drink from it would be revolting.
Right.
And so there's this sort of push-pull happening in there. And I think it does call out some absurdity of social norms in some ways, as I think about it more and more. Like at first, like you said, my first reaction is just like, that's odd. Mm-hmm. And then, like you were saying before I rudely interrupted, because you were getting at the fur being this primal thing. Mm-hmm. And I think earlier you had also said it felt like this ancient artifact.
Yes, yeah.
And I agree there too. And it's weird that it has both of them.
It does, right? And then the other thing that's interesting, so again, showing this piece to students, for example, or even as, an audience member, looking at one piece out of context of her body of work, as you mentioned, I think sometimes doesn't also give weight or gravity to what she's trying to do in all of her works, right? So looking at her kind of body of work is pretty interesting, in regards of how she played with different I don't what are you like found objects, but also, wearable objects, and how she kind of repurposed them. And they're very simple, nothing is, like this 25-foot painting or something, you know what I mean? It's like,
Yeah.
it's like an object or a couple objects put together. She has this one where it's like a white glove, that's a woman would wear. And on the top of it has like vein work done on it, right? So it's like this idea of inside outside kind of, or again, that high society covering, but also this like repulsive inner workings that we don't really want to think about or we want to cover up. She has two like boots, I guess, boots that are kind of slightly pointed towards each other, and it's called the couple. I'm trying to think of a couple other ones that she has. This is one of my favorites. She has two women's like pumps, high heels, right? Where she's like flipped them upside down on a platter and put those little, I don't even know what they're called, like the little chicken, they look like little hats on the chicken legs. You know what I'm talking,
I know what you're talking about, but I'm not I'm not a culinary
You're not a culinary
artist.
expert. I feel like
I do not know the terms for those.
I feel like I should have looked that up beforehand. But anyway, so they're like on the little legs and they make it look, and she's twined it and it looks like a chicken, right? Or a hen, Cornish hen or something like that on the platter. And she has like a table, like a glass round side table that you would have out in a garden or by your couch or something, right? And then the legs are like chicken feet. So just this play on these objects, I think is interesting. I kind of, I don't know, Kyle, if you have thoughts on this, but I always find it interesting what of all of those pieces of work that she has and as a body that kind of say something, why this particular piece is the most famous or known about her.
Okay, so I would point to a couple of things. One thing I would say is this was bought by MoMA. I mean, when it goes into certain institutions, it elevates its status. Like, Grant Wood's American Gothic became a sensation, I think largely because it was bought by the Art Institute like right away. And the fact that this is in MoMA in New York, I think she wanted like 1,000 Swiss francs, but they're like, we'll give you 250. And she took it because who's going to turn down,
right?
Like I'd pay them to put my work in there.
That's like a whole nother, I feel like that's a whole nother podcast is like talking about the art industry, but yeah.
the art industry. But, that's the piece that's in the big name institution that gives it that stamp of validity. So I think that's one part of it. I think also there's something that is just so perfect about this piece that it hits on so many different themes or hints at so many different themes. You talked about the teacup being sort of a feminine symbol, and then you combine that with the name being object. And right away, the feminist lens, I'm thinking like, okay, feminist symbol and object and all of the stuff that we're doing to dress it up and all of that. I think there's also something about the fact that you talked about how you love the playfulism of Dada and the surrealism. I really don't like a lot of Dada work.
Oh my God.
And
how are we friends, Kyle?
I am somebody who absolutely loves play. Like I'm doing a presentation for the Art of Ed's Now conference talking about gamification in the classroom and how fun is a legit learning target and how we need to emphasize play and fun. But what I don't like about a lot of the Dada artists is as they're doing stuff like making a random collage by just dropping pieces of paper and letting them fall where they may and stuff like that, a lot of the craft gets lost, a lot of the design principles. And I know that's a part of the process and it's conceptual art and all of that sort of stuff. But one of the things that I think makes this piece more accessible to a broader audience is the fact that it is very finely and meticulously crafted. That fur doesn't land there accidentally. You know, the movement of the strands of fur describe the form as well as she wrapped it, and all of that sort of stuff. I think craftsmanship matters a little bit, at least for a broader audience.
Okay. Well, I will buy that for this one in particular. You know, we can go on a fight about Dada on another podcast. We can talk about Hannah Hoke. I would love to talk about her. But you know, because there's also process, there's things that have occurred throughout the years, right? That we can appreciate because they happened, right? Like the fact that even if there is this movement of, even right now, contemporary, right, is this like the intuitive art, which a lot of my artwork is with that kind of idea too. And I think there's the piece of like, it's intuitive because you already have the skill and the form and the function that's innate in your, understanding. And so it's about how it's approached from a different lens at this time and the context that's happening, right? So like Dada happening, the happenings, or the, like you say, tossing out a piece of collage. It's like yes and, right? It's kind of like the same context you could say about Picasso, like how people are always like, oh, my kindergartner could do it. Well, yeah, okay, but did they? And also like Picasso had years of extensive, highly realistic work that he could do, and how he broke that. And so that is what makes it so interesting to me, actually, with the Dada movement, even more specifically than Surrealism, right? So Surrealism really does dig into more of like symbolism and things like that. And what interests me personally about Dada is kind of the frustration with the status quo and with the expectations that are the rules that are kind of put on artists at that time, when they were also dealing with a world that was very conflicted, right? With the wars going on, with a lot of fighting, a lot of tension, and a lot of people just in general trying to understand, right? And I think, which kind of clearly relates to what is going on now for us, right? I think that's like an ongoing topic, right?
I was just gonna make a sarcastic comment about how, like, luckily we solved all those things, but but in all seriousness, you are right. The Dada movement was a reaction to just the horrors of. I mean, we're talking about a movement that happened along with 2 world wars, right?
Like, I mean, in the middle is when it kind of started, right?
Yeah. And it was a lot of stuff happening that was trauma collectively people were trying to process. And just to be clear, I don't discount work that is about process and those conceptual pieces and all of that. I do appreciate that. And that's why for my final segment, I talk about like, where does this piece belong? Is this one we learn from? Is this one,
right.
Like all of that. But the initial question was, why does this piece stand out
You're right.
among her body of work?
You're right.
And I think for a broader audience, there are a lot of people who look at Picasso and say like, well, my kid could do that. Yeah. And there's some truth to that. That's never been my criticism of Picasso, to be honest. Right. Even his stuff that looks rough and childish, there's strong technique. The principles of design are at play. Like he is showing stuff. Like there's that term sprezzatura, the studied carelessness, and I think even at his most simplified, he was doing stuff extremely well. It was well executed for his intentions. My problem with Picasso was just that the man was a monster.
Okay, but did you hear the story? So I read this story about Picasso and Meret, and specifically this artwork. I cannot verify it's true, right? But I heard that because she is also like a very strong feminist, was kind of working through the roles of gender and whatnot, that it even irritated her even more so that Picasso is even attached to this story, right? It's like another man kind of giving the weight to this piece, if that makes sense. So it's a very interesting like dichotomy when you really think about how complex these stories can be.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it in that sense. Like, I always thought it was just kind of a funny story about a work of art being developed based on a joke between friends.
Between friends, and like you said, like the fact that they were these artists bouncing off ideas, and it was just kind of like a fun off play. You're right. Like, who would think anything else? But yeah, I heard that.
And now that you're saying that, when we talked about this, you initially asked like, why this piece? And my first thought was this was the one that was bought by MoMA. And, Picasso is another name brand in the art history world where like his name being attached to it probably did give it a little bit of weight socially, just like if, if it had happened because she was out with Marcel Duchamp, or if she were out with Guggenheim or someone like that, someone who has that weight in the art world instead of just like a random no-name artist. Like if she were out at the cafe with Kyle Wood, people probably wouldn't care so much about the terrible joke that I'm making.
Well, it's that, and also that time, which again, like you said, I'm so glad we solved all these problems. But at that time, right, that was like men were dominating that world as well, right? Like men dominate that. And so having that connection, it's not like Meret was talking to, who's another, like Frida Kahlo or something, like, just make that up, right? Like, it's not like, there's other pieces in play, which is also interesting to me.
Yeah. And as we talk about like the historical context of, she was a surrealist doing stuff with found objects, in line with Marcel Duchamp, who always gets credit for creating the first ready-mades.
Mm-hmm.
Listeners who went way back to my Marcel Duchamp episode would recall that there was a female artist, Baroness Elsa Freytag Loringhoven.
Yes.
Right? You know who I'm talking about? Who created a ready-made like a year before Duchamp did. And so, there is always going to be a little bit of that issue of gender and equity at play, and who gets credit for their innovations, and sometimes who gets elevated because they get the stamp of approval because of somebody who is already in a privileged space. There's a lot to unpack here. And I feel like part of the greatness of Object is it's hinting at all of those things. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why it's in the history books, it's in the museum, and it's on the tests, we're talking like 80 years after it was made.
Right. Incredible.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
So I'm wrapping it up. I want just a 3-point rating scale. And where should this hang? The Louvre? Is this something to look at? The lab? Is this something to learn from? Or the Louvre? British for the bathroom.
Yeah. There's a poop joke in there somewhere.
Oh, that's terrible.
This one's definitely for the museum. I think it's a keeper. I love, again, what we talk about in this, kind of to summarize, right? It's like this very simple object, literally object, right? It has so much context to it that if you really think about and understand the pieces in play, I think that's really, really important in history, right? It's really important to help educate and learn about and talk about and, inspire. So.
Yeah, I would agree. As I was thinking about this piece for so long, I was always torn between the lab and the Louvre because, this is one of those pieces that I learn from. And the more I look at it, the more I think about it, the more I reflect on it, the more connections I draw, the more that I do learn from it. And so in some ways it feels like a piece for the lab. But the reason that I ultimately land on the museum, just like you, is because this is a piece that I don't even have to know all of the history behind to recognize some good and appreciate and have almost that instantaneous sort of sensory reaction to it, because it engages not only the look, but like I imagine the feel of it both in my hand and then in my mouth. And like I don't even have to do the research to engage with it.
Right, to connect.
And I think that's one of those things that really elevates a piece and makes it so strong, is that it can pull you in. You know, you learn from it and all of that, but like it stands up on its own even before I do the research. And I think that's really impressive, and that's what makes this a standout, and that's why it's so often referred to as the quintessential surrealist piece.
Bravo, Meret. We're with you.
Well done, Meret. As well, I want to say once again, thank you very much, Janet Taylor. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I really appreciate your taking the time.
Thanks. I appreciate you having me.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.